Hi everybody, I'm Rémi Laurin from Semtech, LoRaWAN director, LoRaWAN Networks director and chairman of the LoRa Alliance LoRaWAN operator community. I'm very excited today to present this new episode of the WAN Network Show. You know now that the WAN Network Show is a new Semtech podcast aiming to interview and to walk you through the fantastic community of LoRaWAN operators across the world, as well as interviewing LoRaWAN thought leaders having an impact on the LoRaWAN ecosystem. And you know what? Today, we are welcoming Helium with Mark Phillips, Vice President of Business Development at Nova Labs. He will explain the difference between Nova Labs and Helium Foundation. Mark, the scene is yours. Please introduce yourself, your company, and maybe the difference between Nova Labs and Helium Foundation.
Yeah, well, hi, Remy, and thank you very much for having me on to discuss Nova and Helium. And very excited about this new series that you and Semtech are putting together. So my name is Mark Phillips. I run business development for a company called Nova Labs. Up until about 4 months ago, we were known as Helium Systems Incorporated. And so the backstory here is that Helium Systems, which has actually been around for about 9 years, which not too many people know about. Actually, the 10th anniversary will be, I think, June of this year, maybe? Or maybe it was the 9th anniversary. Yeah, because it was June 2013. It was founded by Amir. So, we have been around for 9 years. And the first 5.5 were us building, public long-range wireless networks using things that were not LoRa and LoRaWAN. I could talk for hours about what we tried and sort of threw away. And then right around 2017 into 2018, we sort of had this idea that in order to build sustainable, scalable, public, decentralized wireless networks, we needed to get the community involved in deploying the infrastructure. And so we founded what is now known as the Helium Network, which, as far as we can tell, is the largest contiguous wireless network in the world, probably also the largest peer-to-peer network in the world. And then through the course of sort of how the network was built, the intention was always to transition it fully into the hands of the community to sort of operate and govern. And so we sort of capped off that process at the beginning of this year when we transitioned into Nova Labs, which is a for-profit entity that contributes to the Helium Network and the ecosystem. And the governance and the day-to-day managing of the network and a lot of the mechanisms for building the network now fall to what's called the Helium Foundation, which is a fully funded and fully staffed organization that runs and operates the Helium Network day-to-day. So that's sort of the difference between the two.
Okay, cool. So could you share with the audience, because I like to say that a unique proposition is a driver for business development. You have a unique proposition in the market. So could you elaborate on this uniqueness of Helium Networks and what you offer to the market and which problem you solve, in fact?
And so the easiest way to think about the Helium Network is really an incentive model for building wireless networks. So if you go all the way back to 2018 and read the original Helium white paper, which actually is a pretty quick read, there's a lot of things in there that have changed versus what's actually been implemented. But basically the idea was that we wanted to come up with a way to incentivize people to participate in creating wireless networks. And so we started with IoT and specifically with LoRaWAN because we knew IoT and LoRaWAN because we've been doing IoT for the first 5 years of the company. And so, the unique proposition for the Helium Network is that, as an enterprise or as a developer, more and more you don't actually have to get involved with building the infrastructure yourself to use it, right? One of the problems that we kept seeing, and this is why we sort of transitioned into this incentive-based model using what's called the Helium blockchain to sort of distribute the incentive mechanism, was because we kept getting into conversations with enterprises that wanted to deploy very massive LoRaWAN and IoT-based applications, but their business is, shipping things, right? Or their business is growing crops, right? They didn't want to be in the business of actually maintaining the infrastructure. So the unique value proposition is that more and more, and I think we're in 180 countries at this point with 66,000 cities, adding 5,000 cities every month, is that the network will just be there generally. Sometimes you have to add some coverage in the form of a gateway or two. If you're looking at a tricky location, that might not be covered. But generally, if you want to deploy an IoT application using LoRaWAN, the network just sort of exists for you, and the community has shown up to build it on your behalf. That's the unique value proposition of the Helium Network.
That's clear, Mark. But you know that it's been a dream of any IoT player for the last 20 years, how to solve this coverage problem. And you know that everybody is willing to scale, and you did. So how can you explain that you could scale your business model across these 180 countries and more than 1 million gateways?
I don't know if I have a really short answer for you there, Remy. It started, what's that phrase in startup land? Very slow and then all at once, right? We started with one city in Austin, Texas in August of 2019. That was the first city. And we sort of just said, listen, we have this thing called the Helium hotspot, which is, I don't know if this is going to be too blurry, but this is going to be bad. This is a rack hotspot miner from a company called Rack, which everyone in the ecosystem probably knows. That's not the first version of the hotspot. The first version was something that was it's a white box with the sort of black circle on top. And so we sold 150 of these units to, quite frankly, bleeding edge technology and sort of cryptocurrency fans, right? That's sort of where we started. And then from there, as it became apparent that this was kind of interesting and worked, right? You could deploy this network and then you could earn this token, HNT, as the incentive. The community really just sort of took over. What sort of really helped the explosion of the coverage was when we opened up the ecosystem to other gateway manufacturers to build their own gateways and participate in the ecosystem, right? Helium Inc., now Nova, has not actually built LoRaWAN hardware for probably about 2 years, right? We made a conscious decision to work with what is now the Helium Foundation to publish a specification to let other manufacturers participate in the upside, essentially. And so at this point, I think we have 50 different approved manufacturers. And these are all companies that people watching have heard of, like Rack and Tektelic and companies like that, Curling, for example, and many new companies that weren't actually in the LoRaWAN ecosystem that are now making LoRaWAN gateways. So now we're pretty close to 1 million gateways deployed. We'll probably hit it inside the end of this year. We're deploying 50,000 gateways a month across the community. And so it really was that incentive mechanism that sort of spurred it on. And then as the coverage started to be built, that brought in these companies that wanted to actually use the coverage. And they said, okay, well, this is viable. I remember conversations in early, or late 2019, early 2020, where companies were coming to us and saying, well, the coverage is small. You guys only have too much coverage. I'm not interested. I'm moving on. And that was entirely true at the point, right? But as the coverage continued to explode, and they saw the actual utility of the network where they could take a device from a manufacturer and just deploy it and build a dashboard, and off they went. And then maybe add a gateway or two, and say in a factory floor, right in the basement where they wanted to do water level monitoring or water monitoring for pipes. Then they said, okay, this is real. So yeah, it's been a long process, but once the incentive mechanism really became apparent, and people started to really get involved at the community level, organizing in cities, organizing in countries, it really just grew out from there.
Yeah, shall I understand that maybe the recipe may be this open ecosystem? That if there is an analogy with LoRaWAN as a whole, that was built from the ground up to be an open standard where any player of the value chain can bring value. Maybe that's the recipe of scale, right? It's just that you did it with an additional layer that is the cryptocurrency and the blockchain. So for non-specialized people, can you explain in a few words this, let's say, business model based on cryptocurrency, the HNT, that you are implementing?
Sure. Then let me make one comment too on the ecosystem before I move on. We have a team internally that focuses on use cases and helping companies, big and small, deploy sensor solutions. In most of these cases, I would say, these are enterprises that want to monitor something, but they don't really have any sort of internal capabilities, specifically when it comes to LoRaWAN deployments and sensors. And so they usually come with, a use case. I want to monitor a truck that moves from this state to that state, or, this region to that region. And because of the strength of the LoRaWAN ecosystem, we can go out to, any of 100 different partners and find 3 or 4 different sensors that will work. And then we can go to dashboard partners and find 4 or 5 different dashboards that can be customized. And then these things can all be deployed very quickly, and a solution can be brought together very fast. And when we started the blockchain piece, we actually didn't want to use LoRaWAN. We mentioned to write our own wireless protocol. That's a foolish thing, right? And on top of that, the momentum in the LoRaWAN ecosystem, movement that Semtech and the community were making towards more openness with the specification, adopted. So that. I just wanted to make that note. So when it comes to cryptocurrency and HNT, I'll keep it brief, and I'll suggest that people go read the extensive documentation that we have, or any of the thousands of videos that get produced, or blog posts that get written by our community. But as someone who's deploying the network, and we tend to think of it in 2 terms: the supply of coverage and the demand for the usage of coverage. So someone who's operating a hotspot, they're part of the supply, right? So you purchase a gateway from one of the 35 manufacturers. The cost is anywhere from $200 to $1,000 US, depending on what model you're getting. And then you deploy this very easily, right? You put this in a window. Increasingly, people are deploying with antennas on top of roofs. They're wildly professional and very, very resilient, quite frankly. We've turned a very non-technical community into people who are experts in things like antenna design and ways to optimize range of LoRaWAN gateways, which is pretty fascinating. And so when you deploy this, you add coverage to the network. You do what's called assert a gateway to the blockchain, and then you immediately start participating in the incentive. The incentive is sort of 2 flavors. One is for purely providing coverage. This is known as proof of coverage. And based on how your gateway communicates with other gateways in range, you'll earn some amount of HNT over time. The second portion is from data track, right? So every time a sensor that's traveling down the highway passes through your gateway, sends a packet, you are earning a very small amount of HNT that accrues over time. So that's why the supply exists. That's why people use it. And from a demand perspective, as an enterprise, you can sort of as involved in the crypto component as you want to be. What I mean to say there is a lot of enterprises are still not very comfortable with crypto. That's very understandable. So the way that the system is designed is that you can transact with the network. Basically, you can send data from a sensor back to your cloud-based application that's probably running on AWS or Google Cloud, IoT, and only pay for data in a currency that you're familiar with, right? So we have an open source product that we host and operate, and the community has different versions of this as well, where you purchase what are called data credits, like airline miles, right? And so you decrement your total number of data credits for every packet sent through the network. So those are the sort of the 2 sides of supply and then the demand. Nova has a set of products that sort of sit on top of the blockchain. So we like to think of the Helium blockchain as layer 1, right? This is a pure blockchain protocol that provides mechanism and sort of coordinates the network. And then layer 2 would be products that sort of ride on top of this. There's hundreds of companies in the ecosystem now that are offering layer 2 products essentially. So think of companies like DataCake or Tag.io, for example, that have dashboards that ride on top of the community, or cloud providers that have built integration with Helium Network to ingest data from people that are sort of operating on the network. Nova has, in the LoRaWAN space, we have a roaming product, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where we basically facilitate access to the Helium network for other LoRaWAN operators. Companies like Senate, for example, Extelia, Tectena, who just want to get access to the coverage. They could do this on their own, because all this is entirely open source, and they can just take the software and run it and do an integration themselves. If they want a managed service on top of the roaming, for example, Nova Labs has a team that operates a product that people pay us for. So that's a few bits on the business model.
Okay. So looking at your customers, what are the sweet spots, use cases of Helium networks? We see growing the B2B adoption. So people thought that it was only consumer-based network, but it's not. It is, but moreover, we see the B2B market coming and scaling in many regions. So what are the specific use cases or vertical that you see emerging?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We got this reputation as being this sort of consumer-driven network, right? The fact that it was deployed by individuals in ways that typically LoRaWAN gateways are not deployed, right? You know, the space is used to the Senets and the KPNs of the world that are deploying 16 and 64 channel gateways on top of towers, and you know, we took the approach to sort of go with you know, quantity and resilience over you know, the sort of telco grade gateways, and that's worked very well for us. And despite the fact that it's sort of deployed by individuals, that pattern has changed. We still do have, I think, at this point, 250,000 specific individuals or companies that have deployed coverage, which is a pretty wild statistic. It's a truly decentralized effort, but more and more, it's very sort of formalized, right? So we have companies that specifically deploy helium coverage, and they do it in a way that looks more like a telco. They rent tower space, they rent roof space. You know, they do this sort of very efficiently. And so, you know, on the back of that network, which of course, yeah, again, is very resilient where there is coverage, you know, the use cases are really exploding. I would actually say, maybe you'll disagree with me, the consumer device deployments on LoRaWAN have not been that numerous, right? You haven't seen people deploying, you know, millions of GPS tags on dogs, for example, which I think, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is probably the result of two things. One is the availability of hardware, right, for that sort of sensor and device being mass produced at a price point that is low enough where someone wants to pay for it. And the second is the availability of coverage, right? You can't sell something to a consumer that lives in, you know, rural Texas if there's not coverage to sort of provide backhaul for that GPS sensor. We're seeing that change very quickly, and we get a lot of companies that come to us just in the last 6 months saying, you know, this is the coverage that we've been looking for. We want to use LoRaWAN. We don't want to use cellular. We don't want to use Wi-Fi. And so, you know, we're seeing a ton of those use cases on the B2B and sort of enterprise side. I don't know if you watched any of the Helium House proceedings that we did in Austin, Texas about a month ago. Frank, our COO, and Amir, our CEO, highlighted a few use cases. I think they mentioned NanoThings, which is a company I'm sure you're familiar with. They've been in the ecosystem for a long time. They make, I don't have any sensors with me, but it's like, I mean, literally looks like this. It's like a printed sort of thing, right? You just pull the tag and slap it on the side of something. So they have for a long time been looking at the Helium network, and they've now finally just got to scale to the point where they've got hundreds of thousands of tags that have been deployed across both Helium, and they're also using Senet, and they use both networks in parallel through a roaming agreement that we have with Senet. I'm just looking at some stats here from my notes. I mean, they're doing 6 figures worth of sensors across North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific at this point. Their customers are companies like Trident Foods, United States Cold Storage, Sundrop Farms. I mean, these are massive conglomerates that just need to know where their sort of assets are as they move through the supply chain. Their problem, the NanoThings problem, is they can't produce tags fast enough, right, to satisfy their customers. And you know, tracking and tracing, as you know, has long been a promise of LoRaWAN, and I think we're finally helping the community to deliver on that. A few other ones that are more recent. There's a company out of the Netherlands called Dutch Sensor Systems, which is making all sorts of really interesting sound monitoring products. I think the product line is called Ranos, R-A-N-O-S. And so they bundle this with dashboards to do things like local traffic and volume levels in sort of busy cities. The Netherlands has a huge sort of LoRaWAN base. There's another great company out of the Netherlands called Vilok, who I'm sure you've heard of, yes. Which I have one of their little tags. Sorry for the viewers here. I'm going to just ruin my camera. Right, so this is like these things are being deployed on all sorts of micromobility assets to basically do theft recovery. And those guys have been using the Helium network for quite some time. Another interesting one that I was just talking to my team about, I'll just note that we have, like I said before, a team of business development people who go out and source deals. At this point, we have hundreds of contracts signed with companies large and small that are using the network. There's another one out of China called COTX. So they're just doing lots of IoT-related gateways, sensors, cloud-based solutions. And they've got a pretty interesting consumer product called PetFon, which, back to what we were saying before, is a GPS tracker, right? So I think as we start to, as the coverage continues to build and people trust that it's going to be generally where they need it to be, we're going to see the explosion of these consumer devices, which I think will really raise LoRaWAN's profile on the global scale.
Thank you for this comprehensive description of multiple use cases. I like when you say, Mark, the people network, because it's the network of people. We also can think that you're going to support these communities for ESG matters, for instance. Mm-hmm. So do you think you're going to have an influence on improving people's life, improving communities, developing local economies, maybe remote regions that are not covered by IoT? How do you see that, your role in this?
Yeah, so I do think we're already having an impact on that. That's one of the things that, you get, 9 years into building a company and it starts to sort of go faster than you expected. And all of these small things that you never expected to happen sort of fall out of it, which is quite fascinating. So the example that we talk about a lot, you mentioned ESG, there's a lot of people that are also thinking about what's called universal basic income, or UBI, that sort of ties into the Helium network. So we talk a lot about the city of San Jose, which needed sensor solutions, and they decided to actually deploy coverage in their city, and then they use the incentive mechanism to pay for broadband access for low-income housing, which was a wildly successful program. And we've seen cities take that as a model and try to do the same thing. So there's a lot of work happening around that. I saw somebody tweeting about a month ago, I think they were based in South Africa. They've got, I think, gateways deployed in a very specific city. And then this person takes the HNT that they earn and they trade it for some currency. And then they literally go out and they buy food and supplies for local homeless shelters, which was fascinating to me. That's happening in many different places all over the world. We're talking specifically about LoRaWAN here, but the Helium network is expanding into cellular, 4G and 5G, and then there will be Wi-Fi that uses the same incentive mechanism with a formula. In the United States, there is this massive gap for connectivity, between cities and pretty much everywhere else. And if you don't get access, you're just getting left behind, which is terribly sad. The Helium network has a tremendous promise for communities actually get connectivity and get access to the internet, quite frankly. And the incentive mechanism really makes it worth it to deploy this, because you get network to use, but you also give yourself something to earn while you're doing it. So yeah, I think we're going to have a huge impact on that.
So talking about the other side of the stick, you mentioned 5G. You just launched your 5G network a few days ago. How do you see the collaboration between 5G and LoRaWAN? So do you think that there could be a collaboration or complementarity between these two technologies plus Wi-Fi in the coming years?
Yeah, so right. So the quick history on the cellular expansion is that it was actually introduced a little over a year ago. I think it was April of 2021 by a company called Freedom Fi. Freedom Fi traditionally has been a company that sort of does management of public-private 4G and 5G networks. And the CEO, his name is Boris Rensky. He's extremely active in our community, as are most of his team. And so, they introduced the idea that we would add this 4G, 5G capability to the network. We built all these economics around it. And the first hardware actually started shipping, I think, about 5 months ago. And in the next few weeks, the incentive mechanism for 4G and 5G, which is known as mobile, it's a new token, MOBILE, mobile, will actually start being distributed to people who are operating these gateways. I think we have a few thousand that are online in the United States. For the moment, 4G and 5G on Helium only exists in the United States due to some wireless spectrum access called CBRS, which is a bit beyond the scope of this discussion. But what's really interesting about the hardware that's being produced by Freedom Fi, and now RAC has a unit that does 5G, as well as Bobcat, which is a huge manufacturer network, and then another company called Moso Labs, is that there's two pieces of hardware. There's a radio, right, which can be, an indoor 4G, 5G small cell can be kind of small. You can also get an outdoor one, which a lot of people are doing. But there's also a gateway component to it. And so the gateway also features LoRaWAN capabilities, right? So if you're deploying 4G or 5G minor in the United States, you're also deploying LoRaWAN coverage, which is quite fantastic, right? So you're increasing both the LoRaWAN coverage and the cellular coverage at the same time. And we will have in the future manufacturers who are bundling all three of those connectivity layers together: LoRaWAN, 5G, and Wi-Fi, specifically Wi-Fi 6. The Wi-Fi incentive mechanism is a little farther off, but there is a proposal in front of the community from a company called Wi-Fi DABA, which builds these very robust public Wi-Fi networks to sort of start the Wi-Fi earning mechanism. So yeah, I mean, they're going to develop in parallel because the manufacturers realize that people want to deploy both LoRaWAN and cellular at the same time. And that, of course, will feed more use cases as you add coverage for LoRaWAN and 5G. I think you actually end up starting to see sensors that end up being built with two radios. So you see a LoRaWAN radio and a cellular radio, and they favor LoRaWAN when the coverage exists because the battery properties are great and the cost is much lower. And then cellular gets used as sort of a fallback macro network when the LoRaWAN coverage doesn't exist. So yeah, I do think those things are going to grow in parallel.
Very interesting. So Mark, you are well developed in North America, in Europe, in China, less in Latin America, less in Middle East and Africa, and I think less in Southern Europe. So what would be the next regions where you think that you're going to scale?
Yeah, I mean, so at this point, the coverage basically flows to where the community wants to take it. And so what I mean by that is, when you see coverage lagging, I'm actually just looking at some statistics right now. I mean, there's 900,000 gateways, right? 340,000 are in North America, specifically United States, 90,000 China, 50,000 Canada. Germany crushes helium. I don't know why those guys started very early, but there's a massive community in Germany that's doing extremely well. And yeah, so it's focused in North America, it's focused in Europe, and the UK. And then, I think the growth, as I said, the growth is going to be driven by the community, specifically around manufacturers who build products for specific markets. And what we're taking LoRaWAN into countries where people don't even know, right, the regulations. There was a group called, I think they're called Stoffel out of the UK that wanted to deploy applications in the Maldives. And the Maldives had no rules for LoRaWAN. And actually you had to go to a local government agency and get the LoRaWAN spectrum access approved, essentially. And they got this letter and they had to come to our community and say, hey, we got it. And we said, okay, great. And so we worked this into our system that the blockchain uses for recognizing spectrum for different gateways. So again, it's only bounded by where manufacturers are really producing gateways. And to your point, I think we're going to see a lot of coverage develop in Africa. I think that plus South America, you'll see most of the coverage develop in the next, let's say, 12 to 24 months, in addition to the continuous growth of coverage in the existing markets. The ones in the existing markets are actually being driven more by use cases now than they are about pure coverage, right? Meaning, if you look at a major city like New York, Boston, London, Paris, Berlin, there's probably too much helium coverage, right? But the nice thing about that is if you have a sensor that's on a truck, or if you want to monitor your pet as it moves through the city, like you're not going to miss any packets. But as we see companies that want to, for example, monitor the soil moisture level of 5,000 square acres in Kansas, that's going to result in more coverage being built because that coverage probably doesn't exist already. And that's where in the established regions, you're going to see the coverage growth. So the use cases are really driving the coverage growth in a lot of areas, which is super exciting for us.
So I like the way you deal with roaming as well. Even if you have probably today the largest LoRaWAN network of the world, I think that the ubiquity nature of LoRaWAN will come from collaboration and collaboration through roaming. I see you maybe as a big, huge, giant packet collector around the world. In some countries, you know that one LoRaWAN network receives 80% of packets that are foreign frames coming from another network ID. How do you see your role able to collect anywhere in the world, let's say, LoRaWAN packet, and be able to broker it to the owner of the packet quickly using the blockchain, in fact? I understand maybe it's what you have in mind, right?
That's exactly what we have in mind. The thing is, so when we started down this path, we used to look at companies like Senate and Evernet and Actility to some extent as competitors, right? We sort of said, okay, we're going to outcompete these people. We're going to have a commercial offering. We're going to support all these sensors, and then sort of sell enterprises connectivity on top of the Helium network. But we came to realize very quickly is that that was not the best path for us to take, right? If the ecosystem were to grow and LoRaWAN were to become as big and sort of as useful as you know, obviously you and I and our sort of industry peers think it should be, it was better for us to basically offer the Helium network connectivity to companies that used to be our competitors. Quite frankly, you know, a company like Senate, for example, which we know super well and is doing incredibly well in terms of signing deals and deploying sensors. Their deployment model is based around a customer, right? So somebody like the city of Tampa says we want to put, you know, 10,000 sensors out there to monitor like our utility meters. They have to go through this huge process to sign a deal that's got like a 10-year term and has a huge price tag, but it takes a very long time. You know, at the same time, our community just, you know, sort of plows through and continues to build coverage. So it's much easier for us to say, listen, you as a company are primarily interested in selling you know, connectivity services on coverage that you have to build. We already have connectivity and continues to grow. So just get access to what we're doing. And so we started this roaming project sort of quietly, right, with one partner that we sort of talked to and said, hey, you want to give us a shot? And we weren't using the LoRaWAN spec, right? We just had this sort of crazy thing implemented that it looked like passive roaming, right? It was closest to passive roaming. And we just said, you know, we are dropping, in some cases, when we talk to a roaming provider or another network, we're dropping tens of millions of packets a day, right? You know, as you know, the spectrum is public and, you know, the gateway will just listen to it and drop it. In the Helium network, and specifically the blockchain mechanism is based on like a purchasing mechanism, meaning if a gateway hears a packet, but it doesn't have a buyer on the other side, it just drops it. And so basically we get to go to these providers and say, listen, for a very, very, very small fee. And so the equivalent fee is for every $1 you can purchase 100,000 LoRaWAN packets, specifically 20 or below. We can give you access to this. And so at this point, we've implemented I think it's the LoRaWAN 1.1 passive roaming spec. And we can, in our system, run a piece of software that just looks like another LNS that just purchases packets with a target net ID and then pushes it onto an API that's been stood up by the roaming provider. It's very simple, right? The way that the roaming engagements work is that, you know, on a Monday, we can have a conversation with an engineering team. And then on a Tuesday, they can start receiving packets from the Helium network. And because the blockchain is there to facilitate the transactions, we don't have to get any sort of complicated roaming agreements in place. It just sort of works. And so I think over time, you're going to see most of the traffic on the Helium network be facilitated by our roaming partners who are actively out there building solutions for their customers and just taking advantage of the Helium network coverage where it exists.
So very interesting. I like this open-minded strategy. It serves the whole ecosystem. You know that at Semtech, we are strongly supporting the developer community with our developer portal, for instance, and all the action that we have in this area, because we do think that it's the IoT of tomorrow. I know that it's something very important for you guys. So can you develop on how you support innovation and these developers, communities around the world?
Certainly, yeah. So we are probably the best thing to look to is sort of the activity inside of our community, specifically in the Helium Discord server. So at this point, we've got about 200,000 people that have sort of come to the Helium Discord server. I'm not sure if you spend any time in there. It's a wild place for sure, and it can be very hard to navigate. But there is a subset of the community that cares only about facilitating usage of the network, specifically at the developer level. One great story, and this is a theme that you see a lot in the Helium community, is people who come to the network just for the incentive and then get very addicted to the whole thing and figure out how to deploy sensors. And then they start adding to the LoRaWAN momentum because they're buying sensors from manufacturers, deploying use cases, they're building things. There's a guy in Oahu, Hawaii, named Tim Laws, and I know his story pretty well because we just had him at this event that we did in Austin at the Helium House. And if you're interested, you can post a link to this discussion in the show notes. This guy Tim didn't know anything about wireless, didn't know anything about LoRaWAN. but got interested in the Helium network. I forgot how he actually learned about it. It might have been like, I think he said it was a TikTok ad or a YouTube ad or something, or YouTube video. He bought a gateway, deployed it in, no, he tried to order a gateway. It didn't show up from the manufacturer. This is when we were having like the supply chain issues. Then he said, I still want to do this. So I think he went out and bought 8 or 9 more, took delivery on those, deployed them in his local community, and was trying to figure out how much coverage he was actually getting. And so we used to have this thing in the Helium mobile app called discovery mode, where you could just press a button, the gateway would fire off a LoRaWAN packet, and then it would basically report how many other gateways have seen it and give you some range statistics. Due to a few reasons, we discontinued discovery mode. And so he said, okay, well, now I don't know how far my gateways are going, so we got to figure this out. So he went out and bought a few developer kits from, I think, maybe Seed, perhaps. And then he worked with a bunch of people in our community to figure out how to get these things online. Right. So he learned the process of, flashing them with firmware, adding these devices to the console, getting them online. And then he got so into it at this point that he's now selling sensor solutions to companies on his island. So he's working with the local water company to monitor water usage. And he's also working with a farm that actually uses this water to help them monitor how much water they're using. And basically he's helped them reduce the amount of water that they deploy in their farm because they were overwatering and they had no way to know, if their soil was at the right point. I guess they were using 2 times as much water. So he's now like fully in, and we see these stories sort of all over the place. And the way that he got started was through the community. Specifically, actually, I'm remembering it now. We have this project called Mappers. So mappers.helium.com, which is operated by the Helium Foundation. There's thousands of people that are just literally mapping coverage, right? Like driving up and down blocks on bikes and scooters and Ubers and Lyfts. Just putting, hexagons on the map. That's sort of how they appear, and sort of proving out the coverage. And so he started mapping, and then he got addicted to it and is now selling solutions. So that comes fully out of what the community sort of does, right? Someone comes in and asks a question, you get 5 people that give them some advice, and eventually, like, this person is now giving advice to other people on how to get sensors up and running. So that's been extremely positive for the developer community.
Very interesting. We always wonder if Helium makes a strategy at 5 years, or maybe Helium is very good at discovering the strategy and the market evolution. Maybe it's in between these 2 limits. What would be the next step? Maybe nobody knows, I don't know. But do you see next step for Helium and LoRaWAN, or Helium and IoT, more generally speaking?
The only thing that we know from a strategic perspective is that we're going to continue to build the LoRaWAN network and support it in every way that we can. One of the things that we've made a decision around very specifically is to try and let the ecosystem do as much of the work as possible, specifically so that they have a reason to be in the ecosystem, right? For example, if we continued to make gateways, there would have been 40 companies that missed out on gateway revenue, right? If we were selling, we actually don't sell a paid connectivity service, right? We have an active group of channel partners that if someone comes to us and says, we need a fully supported deployment with X, Y, and Z, we say, great, go talk to this company, go talk to that company, right? So we actively sort of farm out opportunities to other companies in the ecosystem. And we've done that very specifically because we want the ecosystem to grow. We want the entire value of the ecosystem to grow. And we're entirely happy to play a role as the facilitator of connectivity, in concert with the community and the Helium Foundation. But I think, if you look out 5 years, you're going to see us continuing to support LoRaWAN. And then the other connectivity pieces are just going to continue to grow, right? So Wi-Fi and cellular, there are discussions around doing things like a decentralized VPN service, for example, a decentralized CDN service. We have this huge, nearly million node large install base. We've been doing a lot of work to simplify the software that runs on those nodes. So the biggest difference between a Helium-enabled gateway and a stock LoRaWAN gateway from a company like Tectelic, for example, is that it has to run the blockchain software, which is not a huge amount of requirements, but it is a little bit more than most people build for. So once the blockchain is completely off of the gateways, which is almost done, you'll be able to take this hardware and repurpose it for other things in addition to LoRaWAN. So imagine, updating a node in the field to run a distributed VPN node, right, and add to a VPN network and sort of earn incentive around that. The team at RAC just announced yesterday that you can take a rack miner, add some firmware to it for the cellular piece, and then just plug in a radio, a 5G radio, and have yourself a 5G miner. So that I think strategically, you'll see us add other wireless protocols, continue to support LoRaWAN, and really continue to prove out that this incentive-driven mechanism for building wireless networks is real, and the world should be using it.
Interesting. Mark, is there a specific message you want to bring to the B2B end users, growing, willing to manage their data, be secured about the sovereignty of their data? You mentioned the console. They may have their own console. They may deploy it in any country to meet with the local regulation. So is there a message that you want to bring to these customers or end users?
So, most people are entirely fine to deploy using the existing infrastructure. When you have requirements around, data sovereignty, for example, everything that the Helium network is built on is entirely open source under very permissive licensing. It's all MIT and BSD licenses, and Apache, I think. So, if you want to, you can take the Helium LNS, which we call router. You can deploy this yourself. You can run it in your own data center. You have to purchase what's called an OUI on the Helium blockchain, which is a little bit technical and in the weeds for this. But we make it very easy to deploy your own router, take full ownership over your own data, manage your own device keys, and then just push that data wherever you want it to go, right? So you can take advantage of the massive public Helium network wherever it exists, but have a private component, which is just your LNS riding on the Helium network, and then just maintain control and sovereignty over your data end to end. So, if there are concerns about that, we're happy to show people how to do that. And again, because we don't really have an enterprise product that we're sort of trying to upsell people on, all we really care about is usage and sort of the utility of the network and proving that it's real. We're happy to spend time and work with companies to help get this stood up and help them run. I think at this point we have, I haven't checked the stats in maybe 2 weeks, but at least 30 different entities operating their own router, their own LNS on top of the Helium network, again, using our open source software and then plugging this data from sensors into wherever they want to go. Some companies have actually commercialized their own version of the Helium console, that it's called, and they go off and they figure out how much they want to charge an entity to use the network. And as long as they're paying that fee for data credits that's flowing through and maintaining the server that essentially enables access to data, they're entirely free to do so. So that's that. I think you're going to see a lot of companies go that direction in the coming months.
Interesting to know, Mark. If I want to connect Helium and to buy connectivity, what's the process?
Sure. So Nova maintains, so we're the primary developer of something called the Helium console, which is an open source device management interface. You can go to, so if a company comes to us and wants to do a proof of concept, we will help them get stood up on the Helium console. We have I don't know what the device cap limit is at this point. It might be 10. I think we might be increasing it. But you can get 10 devices up and running super fast. And if you want to go for a larger deployment, you just you talk to our sales team and say, hey, I want to deploy 5,000 devices. And we say, great. We release, the cap goes up and you can continue to sort of use it. And we tend to put very lightweight agreements in place that we call MOUs, or memorandums of understanding, which basically are like a reciprocal agreement where it says, you're going to use the network, we're going to support you in exchange. Like, we'd like to talk about your use case and so on and so forth. It's a very easy way to do it. Most companies go that way. The Helium Foundation also maintains their own server, their own console, which is free for the community to use for a certain number of devices. We talked about running your own. You could do that. There's also, I think, 5 or 6 companies now, which you can find on our documentation, that are running their own commercial LoRaWAN services on top of Helium. And so, you can go to one of them and you can say, hey, can you help me with this deployment, and so on and so forth. But it's a very easy path to get devices deployed on the Helium network.
Thank you, Mark. It was just awesome. Thank you for your time. Guys, feel free to register to the WAN Network Show. You will have access to the recordings and also interesting links that Mark mentioned. We are having a landing page. Please follow us on LinkedIn and stay tuned. More interviews to come.
Thank you, Remy. This is great.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and sign up for new episode alerts.